Hi, class, and welcome back to Intro to Psych. We're going to cover Chapter 8 today, Developmental Psychology. And to start, we're going to ask a question. How do we become who we are? This is something we're going to cover a little bit more in personality near the end of the series of lectures. But when we think about this, right, this is one branch of psychology, developmental psychology, which is the study of how people, right, change and remain stable across the lifespan. How is it that our thoughts and our behaviors change from being a baby to a toddler to an adolescent to eventually somebody who is right, elderly? How is it that one person becomes, right, a leader of for good, a leader for evil, or any type of musician, or somebody like me? These are all questions we can ask. How do we become who we are? And well, there are two factors, which you have certainly heard about: nature and nurture. So this is going to be kind of an important thing when it comes to this class in this chapter, is the fact that, well, how much is nature and how much is nurture? Well, Jacques Rousseau from back in the 1690s, or excuse me, 1750s, argued that, right, children are able to figure out a lot of stuff without interactions from adults. A baby knows how to breathe. I don't have to teach it that, right? And so our genes and our human nature clearly affects how we grow up. Our nature as, our instinctual decisions. But on the other hand, in the 1690s, Jean Locke argued for tabula rasa, or that children are more or less a blank slate when they're born, that nurture matters here, that the environment a child grows up in, the culture, the people, the types of parenting that they have are going to affect this. And so you ask, is it nature or nurture? Well, it's both, right? So your genes are going to, of course, affect you. They might affect certain personality characteristics even. However, your environment, your parents, the social relationships, the way that your culture said that you should act, that has a role on who you are as well. So from this, we can talk about, though, there is some clearly nature level things here. And one of the things we can discuss is this idea of maturation, maturing. The idea that we mature in fixed steps, right? For instance, motor skills. We can't run before we walk. We can't walk before we crawl. We can't crawl before we roll over, right? My daughter doesn't just, right, when she's 3 months old, get up on her feet. She has to do these things in a set of steps. So which is it? Nature, nurture? Well, we gotta note that there's a nature base here. Our heredity, our heritability, what our genes are, creates predispositions. If if I am 6'5", that might create a predisposition for me to try out for basketball. Definitely not something I do, but right, this is going to be a way that this might affect us. And it's important to note that negative events can be overcome with resilience. It's not the case where having bad parenting or having some, genetic anomaly is going to cause total ruin. It's the fact that, right, we can also become resilient. So imagine if you are talking to James and James tells you that it's really important that, I take my daughter to museums, parks, and theaters, and I take her to volunteer, and I do all of this type of stuff with her. I would probably think that James is somebody who is mainly influenced by nurture. Why? Because, well, all of that stuff is related to how he's parenting or how he's showing this child the environment. He's arguing that the nature aspect's already been set. He's not talking about like, oh, because my daughter has these genes or, right, these instincts. So, recognizing that idea here. Moving on, let's talk about how we develop physically, right? So this is going to be, again, a very brief look into the physical development of children, but I don't want us to get too in the weeds. So one thing to note is that you can affect the way a child is developing from a nurture perspective before the child is even born. This is called prenatal programming. The idea by how mom acts and what she does, what she eats, what she puts in her body. Ugh, that's weird. Is going to affect the baby. And so typically we talk about things like teratogens. Teratogens are anything that could cause a birth defect, from drinking coffee to doing drugs to getting a virus. One thing that happens during pregnancy is women often get morning sickness. And one thought is that morning sickness is useful because it combats teratogens and combats ickiness for the baby by getting rid of it from the mom. Some things that some major teratogens, right, often involve drug use. So doing cocaine while pregnant tends to have a child develop short or underweight, right? They tend to not come to full term. They tend to have learning difficulties and tend to be more likely to have seizures. Children whose mother drinks throughout their pregnancy heavily is going to be more likely to experience fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, so delayed growth and some common facial malformations. Smoking, so smoking nicotine specifically, leads to a higher chance of miscarriage, just a complete lack of development of this child, as well as things like learning disabilities. And cannabis. Cannabis, similar to smoking, is going to cause a lot of problems, but not only that, it seems to cause issues with verbal and memory skills and more likely for children to have symptoms of ADHD. Now, that's just a small list, right? There's a ton of teratogens, right? Even things like the flu is going to be something like this. Drinking caffeine, being malnourished. Some antidepressants, but that is something that you should talk to your doctor about before deciding to go off of an antidepressant. But why does this happen? Well, think about how an embryo is eventually going to develop into a baby, right? What is going to happen is all of the nervous system, right, is going to be developing at certain points of time. And if mother is putting in teratogens into her system, that is going to affect this baby's development. But assuming the baby is has no major teratogens or doesn't have a long history of teratogens, babies will be born healthy and with certain senses. They can understand the world. However, they don't have their full level of senses that you and I do. So in terms of vision, children have been in a womb for the last 9 months when they're born, and they are not able to see anything in that womb. So their vision is extremely blurry. However, within about 6 months, they are going to gain that vision. At birth, their vision is going to be black and white. Those the cones are the only. Cones are not going to be online yet. Black and white vision is the only thing, as that was the only thing that would be useful in a womb. And depth perception. Children are not gaining depth perception, right? You can't throw a ball at a kid and have them catch it. They don't recognize that until crawling age. So, right, takes a while to develop your senses of vision. Hearing, on the other hand, hearing is about developed by the time birth is there. Children, both in the womb and post-womb, right, after they're born, like to hear speech, especially baby talk. And that's not goo goo gaga. That is talking with your voice going up and down like this to a baby. But I'm going to stop doing that because that's incredibly awkward. So they also respond better to higher pitched voices, moms in particular. Why? Well, I've heard mom's voice while I've been, growing. And so I know that is somebody I like. When it comes to smell and taste, children prefer sweet tastes. And actually, if you have a baby compare mom's milk to another mom's milk to being formula fed, babies can recognize their mom's milk. Not only that, what mom eats while pregnant affects what the baby likes. It is true that if you eat spicy food while pregnant, your child is more likely to like spicy foods. I should also note when it comes to this idea of mom's milk. There are slight advantages to being breastfed, but these advantages are very small, and the important thing is that the child is eating, whether it be formula or not. So, sure, babies have these senses, but they're also able to deal with the world in other ways. Just because they can't see you very well doesn't mean they can't recognize what's going on. So, some of the reflexes that babies have from birth are the rooting reflex, this idea that when we stroke a baby's cheek, it turns its head and is going to turn towards whatever that is, typically a bottle or something. Babies, when they are just even a few days old, are strong enough to put their hands on your finger and can be picked up just by two fingers, holding two fingers, and they are holding on. So they have this reflex that when something is there, they will grab onto it. A very interesting one here, stepping reflex. When we have a baby, if you pick them up as if they were walking, babies have this reflex that they're pretending to walk even though they can't support themselves. And finally, this sucking reflex goes alongside the rooting reflex that if you put something on a baby's lips, it is going to try to suck it because that's going to be a very useful thing for a baby who isn't very coordinated. Now, question for you here. Imagine that I have a newborn nephew and he's been born a week ago and I want to buy a mobile for his crib. Which one should I buy here? A, B, C, or, well, his vision's not very good. Well, the correct answer is B, believe it or not. Why? Color vision. And babies are attracted to looking at faces at this point in time. Okay, so now we are going to cover two different major theories here. So we're going to talk about Piaget's stages of cognitive development, and then in a little bit, we're going to discuss the 8 stages of social development. So here, we are going to first talk about Piaget's stages of cognitive development. And Jean Piaget just watched his 3 children develop. And he recognized that children mature in a very specific order. He argued that, well, children's learning happens in a series of steps, just like we have to crawl before we walk, before we run. And that when we are very young, at birth, we are still coming up with how our brain cells should be interacting with one another. We are connecting those brain cells together. And so, one thing we can think about is how children actively seek this knowledge. Again, I'm not going to get demonetized, but if you are interested in a short version of this, somebody did a better version of this on YouTube than I can. So you can go ahead and watch that if you're interested in it. But thinking about how these stages work is that we have to kind of describe what is going to flip us from each of these stages. And it's going to be something called a schema. And a schema is a group of things of some similar idea. It's a framework or a schematic or a blueprint for something, right? So you have a blueprint for what you should do on a date. You have a blueprint for how you should drive your car. You have a blueprint for what you think people should say to one another when they meet each other. You have a blueprint for just about anything in the world for what a college class should look like. And this is useful because it helps us to make sense of the world here. And it helps us to kind of put future info into perspective. And so you can think about, for instance, you have a schema of a chair. And if I ask you, what does a chair look like? You probably think of something with 4 legs, probably wooden, but you might also think of a reclining chair. That's a chair. A beanbag chair. You might consider that a chair, but it's probably not what you thought of right when I said chair. But, this is something that children are going to have to learn. And so when children are able to pick up on new levels and kind of flip this schema of the world, that is going to be one of these powerful kind of components in development. And so the idea here is that when we receive new information, we can do one of two things with it. We can look at it and assimilate it into our already recognized categories. If I'm a child and I have never seen a cat before, like this example here, right? I know what a dog is. So I have a schema for a dog. A dog is a four-legged animal that's furry and has a tail. And then mom and dad bring home a cat. What am I going to do? I'm going to look at that thing and I'm going to go, that's a cat. Or excuse me, I'm not going to know that. I'm going to say, that's a dog. It's just a weird looking dog. I'm more likely to say, oh, look at that doggy, because that fits into my information that I know, because this is just another dog creature. So assimilation is when you put a new piece of info into a similar schema, or you kind of file it away in a category you've already made. However, mom and dad are going to tell me as a baby really quickly that no, this is a cat. Cats are different than dogs, because cats meow and dogs bark. And then I'm able to accommodate. I'm able to change my categories and able to say, oh, so not all four-legged fluffy things with a tail are cats or are dogs. Some of them are cats. And in fact, some of them are like horses or whatever else you're going to, goats, things like that. And so broadening your perspectives. So the idea is that you learn your schemas and you try to assimilate information. If you walk into a new college class, you look around and you go, this is a classroom. I understand that. If you were to learn really specifically about different types of plants, right? You'd start to make accommodations to say, these aren't all just green plants. This is this type of plant. This is this type of plant. So again, another kind of walkthrough of this example, right? If you see a dog and you say it's a dog, right? Congrats. Right? You have a schema for a dog. But if you see this new animal and you call it a dog, you're assimilating. You are putting it in the same category. Now, eventually you're going to be told, no, that's not a dog, that's a cat. And that both of these things are pets, in which case now you're making this kind of new category. So recognizing how schemas and assimilating and accommodating this information is going to affect our stages of development, Piaget's 4 stages here. So here are Piaget's 4 stages. The first stage is our sensory motor period, where we have schemas only for their sensory functions and our motor functions. This is where kids are just learning how to walk and talk, right? At the very beginning, children have no object permanence. They are outright, it's this idea of out of sight, out of mind. For my child, who is less than a year old, for instance, in this example, if I were to take away her stuffed animal in front of her, it's not that she would cry because she misses the stuffed animal. She wouldn't remember that there was a stuffed animal, right? So, once you've left the room, they completely forget about you. However, eventually you learn a schema that, wow, people stay even when I leave, right? Or that if I close, right, peekaboo, the idea that you're still behind there. So this sensory motor period is going to change, right, adapt into the next period once we can get object permanence. But you'll notice it's in its name, sensory motor, senses and movement. The next stage is the pre-operational stage, where we're starting to use a little bit of abstract thought. Children here are able to create symbols used to represent the world. So, my daughter might come up to me with a pen and say, look, it's your magic wand, because she's using this to represent something that isn't there. Also, she's using words, right? Pen, to represent what this is. However, kids at this point don't really understand the difference between an alive object and a dead object. They think that all objects are alive. So my daughter will ask the sun to go away, right, because it's really hot outside. And so, right, this idea that she thinks that the sun went away at night because it wanted to, not because it's not alive. Children at this stage are egocentric, right? Their ego, in this case, not right, big ego thinking they're big and bad, but their sense of who is important in the world. They only have a sense of self, right? Their theory of mind hasn't developed. They haven't developed the knowledge that you have different thoughts than me. And so how we test this is what we call the false belief task. And to do the false belief task, what we do is we put kids in like an example here is one example of this, where they are going to look at this mountain, and they on this mountain is maybe a little house that they can see. On the other side, they wouldn't be able to see it. And so they put a doll here, and we ask this kid, hey, what can the doll see? Well, children who are egocentric are going to say, well, the doll can see this house. The doll can't see that house because that's not how the world works. This child still believes that everybody sees the world through their eyes. Another example of the false belief task here, imagine that mom and dad tell Billy to clean up his toys, so Billy puts them in the chest here. Billy then leaves. Susie here is not very nice. Susie takes all of the toys from the chest and puts them into the box. Now Billy comes back in the room. We ask kids, where will Billy think the toys are? Well, if you have a theory of mind, you know that Billy still thinks they're in the chest. Young children don't have this theory of mind. They ask, or they believe, oh, he knows it's in the box. He knows that Susie put them in the box. That's going to be a problem here. So children in the pre-operational stage are going to move on to the next stage once they understand the schema of conservation. The idea that we can change the way something looks or is, but that doesn't change it. For instance, one of the best examples here is if you give children 2 glasses of water with the same amount of water in them, and you take one of those glasses and pour it into a different shaped cup, like this, and you ask the children, before you do it, which of these has more water? They'll say they have the same. And then they watch you pour the water into another cup, and then you ask them, which of these has more water? They'll say this one. They haven't made this conservation here. Additionally, if you change the way an object looks, or if you spread out an object, children will count these pennies at the top row and say there are a different amount of pennies than the bottom row here, even though it's the same amount, they're just wider. So once we develop this conservation, we can move on to our pre-operational stage. We can leave our pre-operational stage and move on to our concrete operational stage. So concrete operational is the idea that we can now make sense of the world in terms of the real concrete specific things that are going on in front of us. We can categorize objects and sort them into classes. We can follow rules. We can make simple logic. If there are 3 things and I take 2 away, there is 1 left. It's my 4th finger, not a good idea. But children are still having difficulty with really like abstract things, like what does freedom mean? At the end, you get this final stage, the formal operational, where children are able to think in hypotheticals or foresee consequences and imagine what could happen in the future. They can think logically about abstract ideas and question social institutions. Why is it that we all have to go to school? It's not something you want to hear from a 13-year-old, but it's something they can do. Asking people, what if people had no thumbs? A child might say, you'd only have 4 fingers on a hand. An older child in the formal operational stage is going to say things like, well, I could imagine that we would have to change the way that we text if we only had 4 fingers. And, it would change the way society looks. And so that's going to be a little bit more of this abstract reasoning, thinking hypothetically. And so that's kind of the summary of our 4 stages here. Now, if you were to see a question like, Devin here, who likes to play soldiers outside, and one day he and his friends have to go inside because the clouds got sad and started crying. They rained. We'd argue that he is in the pre-operational stage. Why? Because he is still focused on this kind of animism, even though he now recognizes object permanence. On the other hand, Tammy plays this very difficult game where there's lots of strategy that's needed. You'd argue that if you wanted to be good at this game, you have to have a lot of cognitive skills. You have to be in the formal operational stage here. Okay, so hopefully you feel with those 4 stages like that makes some sense. But now I'd like to move on to another theory where we talk about how we develop not just with our abilities to think, but how we develop socially. And so we're going to start with Erikson's 8 psychostages of development. And the way you want to read this chart is that you start here on the left with infancy, when you're born, and we work clockwise around here until we get to maturity. So here's a short list, here's a list of all 8 stages, and as well another great video for you to watch that goes over everything. But given that I will not be copyright striked, let's talk about them here. So there are 8 different stages of psychosocial development, and each stage is going to be during a certain period, and we are going to have a crisis that we are going to kind of be trying to figure out. And each of these crises will basically be related to a question we are asking ourselves and trying to answer, a very existential question in this 3rd row here. So let's go over these pretty quickly here. So when we're born, there's not a whole lot we can do, right? We are in that sensory motor period. We're trying to figure out how to move our arms and legs and walk. Mom and dad have to take care of us at this time in our lives. And so our major crisis is this idea of, can I trust those people around me? Can I trust people, or should I mistrust those people, right? Or is it a bad idea if I trust them? So are mom and dad showing up when you are crying as a baby, because you want milk or held or whatever? If mom and dad are showing up, giving you the what you need, you're able to trust, right? You learn that, okay, people will help me. If you don't, you might learn that people aren't always there to help you. From about 1.5 to 3 years old, we then learn this idea of autonomy versus shame and doubt. Is it okay to do the things you do, right? At this point, children are starting to get potty trained. Are mom and dad going to shame you for, accidentally using the bathroom where you shouldn't have? Or are they going to say, that's okay, we're learning? That's going to maybe give a child a sense of autonomy. I can go do things versus, I'm not a good person. From there, from 3 to 5 years old, children now are starting to look at this idea of initiative versus guilt. Can I go try new things? Should I do things? Or is it the case where every time I try something, I'm getting in trouble for doing those? Should I stop doing those things that make me feel bad? Right? So if my daughter draws on the walls, for instance, then I might yell at her. And that might theoretically, if I do this a lot and tell her, don't do anything, blah, 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 don't do this, don't do that, that might make her feel like she can't try anything. From 6 until puberty, which I put at 10 here is originally what they said, but I'm going to call it puberty, we are now in school, and we are starting to look at each other in school and say, hey, am I listening to the teacher? How am I doing compared to all of my peers? Can I follow directions? Can I make it? From puberty to early adulthood. So you can think about this as late middle school, early high school. People are really interested in figuring out who they are, who they can be. Originally, this was said to last until about 20 years old, but I'd argue, given that many people spend about 4 years in college, that they used to not culturally, people are going to spend more time in early adulthood, this stage. This, what do I want to do? Can I try new things? Who do I want to be? The next stage after that is young adulthood. So mid 20s, early 20s type thinking till middle age. That is intimacy versus isolation. This is now, can I love people? Am I loved? Am I going to find a partner that's somebody I can, settle down with? From there, people start to wonder, how do I make my life count? Is my job a good job, or am I just spinning my wheels? What am I doing that matters? At this point, people might take on a role of like coaching a little league team or something because they want to make their life count. However, some people might sit and say, wow, I've just been lazy for the last 20 years and haven't done anything. The final stage, I think, is best represented by two stereotypical types of old people. You have old people who are really, really kind and nice, and you have old people who are really, really grumpy. And you would argue that those who are really, really nice have conquered this last stage and have integrity about themselves. This idea that I did live a good life. I made my life count. I'm loved. I know who I am. I made it in the world. It's okay for me to be me and try things, and I can trust those. That'd be pretty good. Versus despair, this idea that, oh no, it's the end of my life and I'm not happy with what I've done. So all of these stages are something that these are questions that you are very likely to ask yourself in your life. And knowing this is pretty helpful, but figuring out, how can I push myself to find an identity, to find intimacy, to be generative, to feel like I lived an integral life. So that's the overview, and I'd like to talk about two specific stages more in depth here. And the first one is identity versus role confusion. And I just want to briefly talk about this idea of how we form an identity. Well, one way that we form an identity is by making a commitment for what we want to do. You have committed to go to college, if you're watching this video, most likely. If not, right, you have not necessarily made a commitment. And additionally, you can ask, have you explored all of the possibilities that you realistically want to explore? Now, so you can imagine a person who has made a commitment after exploring everything. I looked at all the majors that I wanted. I checked out different career paths, and I said, I want to be whatever. Well, congrats. That's identity achievement. You've checked everything out. You've decided this is what you want to be. You have an identity. What happens if you make a commitment because like mom and dad told you to? You're going to be a medical doctor and there's nothing you can do about that. Well, that's what we call an identity foreclosure, being committed to a particular identity, but not exploring their options, going to the army or, doing something of this sort. What if, on the other hand, you haven't made a commitment and you haven't even really tried? The person who's just living in their mom's basement, not doing anything. This is identity diffusion. You just either haven't confronted your identity crisis yet, or you're too overwhelmed to figure out how to make it in the world. And finally, we have identity moratorium. This idea that, well, you're kind of in limbo. You're looking for what you want to do, but maybe you haven't committed. So if you're trying new classes at the start of college, you might still be in this moratorium. And so this helps you to figure out, how can I find an identity? How can I find who I am? On the other hand, another thing I'd like to talk about is the last stage. And so talking about dying and grief, this last stage of life where we have to confront how we lived our lives. Many of us have heard of the Kubler-Ross 5-stage model of grief model, where you go through denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. There's no real good evidence to suggest we all go through each stage in that order. However, there's some good evidence to argue that we could place you in one of 4 baskets after grief. So after you have a very tough situation, you lose somebody close to you, there's a major upset in your life. There's 4 different ways that you can go, that people typically go. The first is, it doesn't really affect you. You tend to be pretty resilient to these things, If your parents get divorced or something and you just, it sucks, but you make it work, that's going to be a resilient factor here. Some people grieve and then go through recovery. right? So, being upset because you lost a family member for a couple weeks or a couple months, and then having that grief slowly lower. We can talk about chronic dysfunction, similar to recovery, but no recovery, right? So you lose a loved one, and there is no recovery. It just continues on. It is chronic. Followed by the fourth trajectory, some people, right, you can imagine if, right, you were to lose a spouse or something and have a child, a young child, you might not grieve at the moment. You might choose to grieve later because you're worried about other things. And so recognizing that that is another pattern of grief and that grief might come up later. So this is, again, just something useful to think about when we are considering, well, how is it that, we grieve, and how is it that we deal with these things that are going to be important in our lives? But from there, let's talk about how we end up getting to who we are. Well, we can talk about the fact that before your personality has really developed, if you're going to argue that personality is developed later on, is that we are all born with a temperament, a basic disposition, a basic way we react. And that is partially influenced by our genetics and partially influenced by teratogens and how mom, did or didn't avoid those in the environment. And so you can think of you as a baby, ask your parents or whatever, were you an easygoing baby, this first type of temperament, right, where you just tend to be a happy-going baby? Were you a difficult baby, tend to be in a bad mood, have difficult schedules, not liking novelty? Or were you kind of in between, maybe this slow to warm up, where you're not as grumpy, but, you're just not good at change? Now, not everybody falls into one good category, but the majority of us will be considered in this easy type of temperament. Another question for you here. If you are watching your friend's daughter named Opal, and Opal just always gets upset when you first show up, but over time she gets to know you, you would describe Opal's temperament best as a slow to warm up temperament. Now, we can talk about temperament, and that's important, but temperament is kind of the precursor to attachment. And attachment is what we're really interested in when it comes to learning about psychology here, if you ask me. Now, we can talk about imprinting, which is something that some animals do, not necessarily us. This is Conrad Lorenz, right? He used to do research on imprinting and attachment, and he found that, right, ducks imprint on the first thing they see when they are born. So he was the first thing they saw when he was born. So what do you know? He became mother duckling. However, humans don't work that way, right? We work on an attachment style. It's not just this. So we can talk about a guy named Harry Harlow. So Harry Harlow did some experiments on monkeys, and these aren't necessarily the most fun experiments, but what he was interested in looking at was taking baby monkeys and seeing what's more important to a baby monkey, being comfortable or having food. And what he would do is he would take these infant monkeys, remove them from their mothers at birth. Again, not a very nice thing. And what he would do is he would give these monkeys basically an option. Do you want this monkey that is warm? There's a light bulb under here that is going to keep this cloth nice and warm. So the similar to, cuddling your baby. Or do you want to sit on the wire version of the mother that only has a kind of food output here? It's just like a bottle in a wire. Turns out children, and monkeys in this case, are preferring physical comfort over food until they're getting so hungry they need to eat. So, taking that Henry Harlow set of theories, another guy named John Bowlby recognizes that, well, that must be useful for something. Why is it the case that it's not just for food? Well, attachment is useful because it keeps us safe. Well, attachment allows us to have a secure base in a safe haven. We know that we are, that we can run to mom and dad and they will keep us safe. and they will protect us. Now, the important thing to note about that as well is that however you as a child are seeing the world is how you are going to perceive that that is the way the world works. So the way that you are treated as a child affects the way that you believe you should be treated in relationships. Now, why is attachment important? Again, however you feel as a child sets up how you think you should act as an adult. So, a student of John Bowlby's, again, we're just going to talk about a lot of people here, Mary Ainsworth devised this really great study type, a way or situation, we'll call it, in order to determine a child's attachment style. So, what we are looking at in this strange situation is how a baby is going to act around mom, and then what's going to happen when we maybe make mom leave. Now, of course, we can't ask babies how they feel, so this is a good way to do this. So, the steps in order are that we bring a child into a room with mom, and right, so child knows mom, child's happy in this new room. You can imagine this like bringing a kid into a doctor's office, right? And you are now waiting for the doctor to show up in the little room. Then a stranger comes in. You have a person they don't know, just like if the nurse came in the doctor's office. What we do is we see how they react. Are they afraid of this person? Are they okay with this person? Then what we do is we have the mom leave the room and we leave the baby with the stranger and we watch, how does the baby react? Does the baby start to cry because mom's leaving? Does the baby just say, I don't care? We record that reaction. We watch how mom, we watch how the baby acts when mom gets back. When mom comes back, does the baby want to go to mom? Does the baby want nothing to do with mom? And then maybe a couple other steps. The beauty of this is we can kind of put you into one of 4 attachment styles here, and it gives us a good indication of how we feel in terms of relationships. So there are 4 types. The first type is a secure attachment. Right? This idea that if mom and dad go away, you kind of aren't exactly happy, but you're not, scarred for life. You're happy when mom returns, you're easily comforted. On the other hand, there are 3 insecure types of attachment. The first is anxious ambivalent, or we'll hear this called ambivalent. This is where you're going to greet mom, but you might get really upset or angry when mom comes back. Right? You're kind of like almost pouting because mom left you. Anxious avoidant, on the other hand, is going to be somebody who's avoidant. They don't really care at all. They just might avoid the parents. When mom leaves, they're not going to cry. When mom comes back, they're also not going to really care too much. Disordered, on the other hand, is going to be this idea that the infant's behavior is inconsistent, disturbed, or problematic. But again, the way I want you to think about this is that however mom and dad act to you, are mom and dad nice, kind? Are mom and dad only doing things every once in a while? Are mom and dad ignoring your needs? Are mom and dad screaming and yelling and making you scared, but there's nobody else to help? All of these affect the way you are going to perceive your relationships with not only your parents, but your friends, their families, things of this. And so what I want to note about that is how your attachment style, right, is going to affect your relationships with your family down the road, if you choose to have one, right? So if my parents constantly ignored my needs, for instance, and I was an avoidantly attached individual, it'd be hard for me to find a relationship because I probably wouldn't care about that too much. Because as it turns out that your childhood attachment style, it positively correlates with how likely you are to have that attachment style as an adult. And so it turns out that, right, like as a child, these do link over. And you can think, how do you feel about yourself and others? And depending on these, you might fall into one of these 4 categories. Now, there's a lot of ways to kind of perceive this attachment style, but I want you to just really get at the fact that there are 4 attachment styles that have different outcomes, different characteristics, right? Where being in a secure relationship as an adult means that you're going to be comfortable with relationships versus an avoidant person. You're probably not even going to show up in a relationship. You are going to not really, if your partner says, I'm leaving, you're going to say, okay, whatever. An anxious person is going to be the person who is at the most extreme, checking in on your location every 10 minutes, wondering why you haven't contacted them after 30 seconds from a text. And lastly, a fearful, disorganized individual might be somebody who wishes that they were close to others, but fears rejection and abandonment, so they don't even try with others. So, right, if you have a 12-month-old who's crying for attention, but mom's too busy to pay attention for him, so when mom eventually says, all right, what did you want? And picks him up and says, here's your toy. When that baby just pushes you away and keeps crying, you could probably argue that that child has you might call this a resistant or anxious attachment style. Now, it's important to note that, or like we said, those attachment styles also affect how you're going to feel about your children if you choose to have them. And so you can imagine that there are 4 major types of parenting styles, or we can put people's parenting styles into 4 different categories. And the first one is going to be what we call authoritative, the best one. This is where you are a demanding parent, or your parents are demanding. They're asking a lot. They're saying, you need to get good grades, you need to do well in school, you need to, have a job, blah, blah, blah. But they are kind and caring and listening to you and being responsive to your needs and wants, right? So saying, hey, we need to do this. How can we do this? Compare that to an authoritarian parenting style. And this is going to be a parent who is very demanding, says you need to do all of those things, but isn't very responsive, is saying, I don't care how much this is stressing you out, just do it or get it done. Finally, we can talk about parents who are permissive, the ones who aren't very demanding at all. They're not going to enforce any rules. They're just, overindulging the child. They're letting the kid have whatever they want and, not necessarily holding them to the standards that they should be. Finally, you have neglectful parenting. So these are going to be the parents that are just not paying attention to you, indifferent to a child's social and emotional or behavioral needs. So these individuals can physically give you, right? That doesn't necessarily mean they don't care about you. It might be the case where the parents are too busy, or there's other children involved, or there's, some kind of family issues, a sickness, something of the sort. But right, this idea of neglectful parenting is, I'm not really around to help you out if you need help, and I'm not really going to ask things from you. So if you think about what kind of parenting style is best, we want this authoritative parenting style. Now let's finish up this class with 2 quick things. The first we're going to talk about is Kohlberg's stages of moral reasoning. And so this is the Heinz dilemma. The short of the long with this dilemma is a man's wife has cancer, and there's a new drug that will save his wife that the guy in town just made. However, he wants way too much money for the drug. So the husband tries whatever he can to get enough money, and the person who made the drug says, too bad, you don't have enough. The wife was dying, and so he said, okay, whatever, sneaks in late at night, steals the drug, and gives it to his wife to save his wife's life. Then we ask people, should you have done that, and was it right or wrong? Why? Now, we're not really interested in whether you think they should or shouldn't have done it, but we're interested in why. And what we learn here is that you'll have to note that on the left-hand side with the writing, it goes from, it's the opposite from the picture here. So the top is the bottom is the top. That at the most basic level, if you were to say something like, yes, because he loves his wife, or, no, because you don't want him to go to jail, you'd argue that this is morally reasoning at a very low or pre-conventional level. However, once we get a little older, most people get to a conventional level where we are basing our choices on rules and conventions. Well, we are having to kind of go back and forth, between other things. Is there a duty to save your wife? Was there an obligation for this guy to sell it so you don't feel it's too bad? However, we can also think at the most extreme, some people get to this post conventional level, this idea that all of a sudden, right, you might think that, well, laws don't necessarily always work for every situation. Maybe there are specific universal principles like loving one another that we should focus on that affect our moral reasoning. So, what this is saying is that how we decide what we agree or disagree with is very much affected by how we choose to reason. And the final thing we'd like to talk about here is briefly this idea of sex and gender. So, to be very clear here, sex, when we're talking about this, is the physical way that your body, right, genetically is, or in this case, being born in a certain way. Compare that to gender roles. Gender roles, stepping into a cultural role, stepping into kind of, like a actor steps into a role, are certain behaviors or appearances that we believe are being associated with being a male or female. We have a gender role that women have longer hair than men as a typical thing, right? So, or that women, in the past, have not typically gone to work as much as they have stayed at home. Compare that now to gender schemas. So, right, we talked about a schema or a blueprint. We all have personal blueprints about what is appropriate for boys and girls. While gender roles, right, our culture might say that boys can't play with dolls, theoretically. A gender schema, your personal belief is that boys and girls can play with dolls, and that maybe makes sense there. So, recognizing how all of this kind of helps us to realize how we develop from being a young child to all the way to being an elderly person who has lived an entire life. So I hope you all feel like that information has stuck. I know there was a lot of it. I would encourage you to go search for those videos online for some extra help. But if there's anything else I can do, don't hesitate to reach out. I hope you're all doing well and have a great day. Bye-bye.